Welcome to the second half of my interview with Tom Przylski, author of the book Californio Lancers, the 1st Battalion of Native Cavalry in the Far West. Now, in the second half, we discuss the end of the Civil War and the unit's deployment to Arizona and the different challenges and actions they took in that period, dealing with things like malaria and desertion, but also campaigns against the Apaches and dealing with French imperialists in northern Mexico. We also get into things like their uniforms, language barriers, different leadership dynamics, and commanders like Salvador Vallejo and Captain Pico, Colonel Ronstadt, other interesting figures, and ultimately into their legacy, their ultimate legacy of the Californio Lancers. So listen now to the second half of my conversation with Tom Przylski. And then eventually they were sent to Arizona, as you mentioned. Mm-hmm. When did that happen, and why did that happen?
Okay, that happens. Well, they first start talking about it toward the end of the Civil War, by late winter, early spring in this when the war is still going, of 1865, for various reasons that you'll have to read about in the book because they get very complicated. They aren't able to bring the whole battalion together until the summer of 1865, by which time the war officially is over. But officially, the war, in some ways, the war is over. I mean, the Confederate Army has surrendered at Appomattox, but the recruitment is continuing, especially in the West. Troops are still deployed in the East Coast. The troops are still deployed in the South for reconstruction duty. So it's very the war is still on in the minds of the military planners. And of course, the important thing is that the war is still going on in Sonora and Mexico. And that's why they're sent to Arizona. There's kind of two things going on. Number one, they need more soldiers in Arizona to fight the Apaches. The original group of California volunteers have all been discharged. They've had their 3-year enlistments, so they need to grab up any soldiers they can and send them to Arizona to fight the Apaches. General Mason is planning a massive campaign against the Apaches. The other thing, of course, is that the French have invaded Sonora, and because the French have invaded Sonora, the Imperialists are able to take over Sonora. They're able to kick out the Republican government that was in Sonora. The governor of Sonora, his army has been completely broken. Him and his one of his officers, who is a guy by the name of Ronstadt, by the way, that's it's very important if you're from Tucson. So Governor Pesquera and Colonel Ronstadt are fleeing into Arizona. They actually arrive in Arizona at the same time the native cavalry does. And so Ronstadt, Frederick Ronstadt, and Governor Pesquera kind of set up, while the native cavalry are coming in and kind of setting up what becomes known as Fort Mason. The Colonel Ronstadt and Governor Pesquera are setting up kind of a ad hoc capital of Sonora in Arizona. So they're actually in the United States running a Mexican government at a place called Calabasas, which is now part of Tumacacori National Monument, National Park. And so the native cavalry gets there, and I guess a lot of activity is slowed down because they arrived in the middle of what is kind of the high malaria season in Arizona. And obviously in Arizona, you have to locate your post where there's water. And back in those days, the only places where there were water were basically swamps, and they were a lot of flies and other insects that carry things like malarial fever and typhoid and stuff. And of course, they weren't used to this at all. There were some other soldiers there from Sonora who just fared this just fine, but the folks from California did not do so well. So there's this period of maybe a month or two where nearly all the soldiers are sick. Now, while this is happening, some of the soldiers who weren't so sick were actually sent into Sonora because soldiers who had deserted en route were rumored to have been captured by the Imperialist army and held at Magdalena. And this is like one of the strangest stories in the whole Native Cavalry saga. The Company A and B, the ones who are well enough, are sent down there basically to recover these deserters. They confront the Imperial Army. Number one, when I say Imperial Army, there's some wonderful description of what these guys were, and they were not. They seem to have been like these conscripts who, without uniforms and with they were armed with muskets and stuff, but still, they were the Imperial Army. And there's this confrontation where Captain Pico basically is trying to start a war, or apparently is trying to start a war, and someone talks him down, and eventually he returns home. But on the way home, he accidentally shoots himself in the foot while pursuing what he thought were Apaches. And bear in mind, he's supposed to be the greatest horseman in all of California. He fell off his horse, accidentally shot himself in the foot, and then he ends up spending the rest of his time in Arizona convalescing, either in Tubac or Tucson. And at one point, there's this account of him being taken back to California by one of the regular supply wagons that comes into Arizona, and he doesn't ultimately he doesn't serve the whole time with his company, and eventually he does. When he dies, I think it's like 1909 or something. They mention he died because of an infected foot, and I always kind of wonder if that goes back to this incident, or if it's another incident where he was wounded at the Battle of San Pasqual when he was a very young man.
So did they then? They did wind up having also campaigns against the Apaches, you mentioned.
Yes, they were. At one point, it's January of 1866, and which kind of tells you a little bit about what the state of their morale was, because the Civil War was over. The Sonora, for the most part, was no longer an issue. It was getting to be under Republican control, so there wasn't a threat coming from there. And also, they were on 3-year enlistments, and so they were all anxious to go home and get discharged. General Mason, however, wanted to do this campaign, and there actually is an incident. There are a few incidents where there's a mine. I don't know how much listeners are familiar with Arizona history. There's a mine near a town called Arivaca called Cerro Colorado. And apparently that was attacked by Apaches, and the folks at Cerro Colorado sent a message to Fort Mason saying, "Hey, we need some help here." And Major Cremini, who at that point was in charge of the post, just said, "Hey, no, we can't spare any men. Too many people are sick. We don't have enough weapons, and General Mason wants to send us out to fight Apaches, to fight Cochise, in east of the post. So anyway, there's this massive campaign which would have worked under slightly different circumstances. Basically, General Mason's idea was to have troops basically marching kind of a circuit around what is now Cochise County, and to keep the Apaches constantly in motion and eventually exhaust them and force them to surrender and presumably be placed on a reservation, which is a strategy that worked under General Crook 20 years later. But Mason did not have the resources that Crook did in terms of like a communications infrastructure or anything like that. He just had the native California cavalry and some other California volunteer units, and strangely enough, some volunteer units from New Mexico. At one point, they actually crossed paths with the volunteer units from New Mexico. So they're marching. It's Captain Jimeno. I think it's Captain Jimeno, and I don't remember the other one. Jimeno is leading a detachment of native cavalry, and I mentioned him specifically because he kept a journal of where he was going. It's a bit of a mess. The first thing they have to do is they have to find their scouts. Their scouts never reported to Fort Mason, so they actually have to go into Sonora, to a town called Santa Cruz, and find their scouts. They know their scouts are like hanging out in Santa Cruz, and I picture this kind of very cinematic picture of Captain Jimeno walking into a bar and saying, you're supposed to be our scout. Come with us. So they find they get their two scouts, who are both, I believe, are both kind of assimilated Opata Indians. I don't remember their names, but they turn up over and over again. And they go across what's now called the Sulphur Springs Valley to the Chiricahuas, and then to Fort Bowie in the Chiricahua Mountains. Fort Bowie, of course, was established by the California Volunteers a few years earlier. At this point, it was basically kind of these rock hovels in the mountainside. It was not a pleasant place to be, and they discovered that Fort Bowie actually did not have enough food for the soldiers. They were waiting on a shipment of food, so they go south along the Chiricahua Mountains towards Sonora, and they happen to meet the supply wagon that has all the food, and they end up escorting the supply wagon. It gets to be a mess, but they find sign of the Apaches. Porfirio Jimeno actually does confront a group of Apaches at what's now called the Wilcox Playa, a big dry lake bed in what's now Cochise County, and he pursues the Apaches all the way to the Dragoon Mountains at what's now called the Cochise Stronghold, and then they kind of disperse after that. One thing that becomes clear, in addition to this campaign being really disorganized, is that the Apaches are already leaving. Cochise is already just packing up and leaving Arizona, going to Sonora, where he thinks he's going to be safer. And though in the end, General Mason and General McDowell take a lot of credit for driving the Apaches out of Arizona, if you look at the full historical record, what's going on in Sonora as well as Arizona, it's pretty clear that the Apaches were leaving. And they weren't pursuing them, they were just following them. And we definitely know they were not carrying lances in this campaign, because Major Cremeny mentions it in a letter where he says, when they went out on campaign, they exhausted the entire supply of firearms that was being kept at Fort Mason. So they clearly turned in their lances and picked up rifles or carbines before they went out.
So there's clearly a time when Lancers is just sort of a ceremonial title.
Yeah, yeah.
Who were these, just kind of circling back to the beginning of it, who were these men who were recruited, and how did they go about recruiting them? I mean, what kind of incentives were they given to join?
Well, definitely for companies C and D, there was a lot of economic issues. There were kind of, during the Civil War era in Southern California, there were kind of three big disasters that occurred. There was floods, there was a smallpox outbreak, and then there was a drought. And I may have them in the wrong order, but they were all in rapid succession. And especially the ranches were in really bad shape. And of course, the vaqueros were either itinerant or they were kind of almost serfs in some of the ranches, depending on like their own personal circumstances. And I think a lot of especially the vaqueros and people in general, because the economy was hit as a whole, they just didn't have any work. And I know this is precisely, there's actually a mention of this when they're talking about the recruitment of Company C, when there's mention of it in the newspapers, that basically the De La Guerra family in particular was hit really hard by the drought, and their vaqueros had no work. And so I'm not sure given kind of the almost kind of paternal power that the De La Guerra family had in Santa Barbara at that point, if they were just ordering their vaqueros to, oh, you're joining the army now, and they said, okay. Or if it was, hey, we're not going to be able to pay you, but you can join the army. I don't know how that worked. Because you look at it kind of like in terms of when there's like a civil war in Sonora, all the vaqueros work for the hacendado as soldiers, and then when the conflict is over, they go back to herding cows.
Right.
So I don't know if that was the dynamic that was going on, or if it was that these people were actually volunteering because that was an option for them. Company A was a little different because there was actually some patriotic fervor involved, because Captain Pico was such a powerful political figure in San Jose, and he had given this very patriotic speech, which is of course it's in the book, but it was off printed in the papers. And Company B was weirder. I'm pretty sure a lot of that was economic. Some of it was patriotic, but initially, there were a lot of French folks joining Company B. A lot of them deserted.
I saw that group of French soldiers.
Yeah, but that gets weirder. Okay, so you have these Frenchmen who join. Most of them desert. I'm pretty sure it's because of the politics. You even have them. There's a detachment that's sent to Angel Island. I'm not sure exactly what they did on Angel Island. I take it they did something about maintaining the battery there or something. But they actually tried to desert Angel Island. It's like, how do you desert from Angel Island? So right. I actually found an account of someone who deserted Angel Island. Well, not a native cavalry soldier, but he actually swam to Tiburon.
Wow.
And apparently he had done this multiple times, and at one point he actually drowned in the process. So, so they're in different different places, different motives. But eventually, when Captain Jimeno takes over, after I think there's almost complete turnover in the company. There's only a handful of people who are from the initial group that's recruited. Um, Captain Jimeno starts recruiting more kind of Latin American immigrants, Californios, and I don't know exactly what their motives were, but it transforms the company. However, this is the weird part. Right toward the very end, shortly before they leave California to go to Arizona, there's a group of French surnamed soldiers who are all recruited all at once. And I think they may even be signing up in Los Angeles from barracks. But it turns out that these are people who deserted the French army when
In
things
Mexico.
in
Uh-huh.
Mexico. Yeah, I don't know if they were actually from Sonora, but they were. There's actually mention of oh, these guys were in there, and they're listing their birthplaces like Algiers, and in one case, one of the soldiers may actually be African. I mean, like, because they list them as being dark complected and stuff. So this was a truly interracial unit, because you had Native Americans and Mexican Americans, Anglos, and then at least one African.
Do you know anything about that? Now that you mention it, anything about the Native Americans who participated and why they might have?
Um, well, I think, I mean, you've had shows about this. The notion of ethnicity in frontier California is really complicated. I think some of them just basically considered themselves Mexicans, and some of them are from the mission tribes, who are in a lot of ways what they call the mission tribes. They wouldn't use this term now, but they are kind of assimilated into Mexican culture in a lot of ways, though they do maintain their own cultural identity. Um, there's a lot of Yaquis. The Yaquis, of course, initially came to California during the gold rush from Sonora because they were already in the mining industry in Sonora. So they had skills that they could bring into California. So there are quite a few Yaquis. Um, and of course, it's hard to break them out because they don't list the ethnicity. They just list, complexion. And then, oh, this guy's from this one village in Sonora that's largely Yaqui, so he might be Yaqui. And of course, the Yaquis have a complicated history as far as like their cultural identity because they assimilated into Mexican culture entirely on their terms. So, again, they're not going to be to an Anglo-American. They're not going to be distinguishable from other Mexicans, but in their interactions with other Mexicans and Mexican Americans, people are going to know, and people are going to recognize like little linguistic things and that sort of thing. But yeah, so they are there, and so again, it's a very racially mixed unit. One of the things that's interesting is when you go through the pension documents, there's at least one soldier where there's like a little note in the pension documents and documentation that says, this man is an Indian. Are we supposed to be giving him a pension? And of course, he gets the ruling from higher up is, yeah, he served in the army. It doesn't matter if he's an Indian.
Wow.
Yeah, so remarkably progressive attitude but it's Reconstruction era, so there's a lot of that going on.
So I would just reading excerpts from Antonio Coronel's times in the gold fields in Alta California or in California, and he mentions Sonorans. There are a lot of Sonorans.
Mm-hmm.
So oftentimes when those Sonorans are mentioned, they could have been Yaquis. Is that
Some of them, yeah. I mean, there's even some place names in like the Gold Country. There's like Yaqui Creek and that sort of thing. So yeah, and I used to work for the Pasco Yaqui tribe, and there's a small Yaqui community to this day in Fresno. I don't know if it dates back that far, but the presence, and of course in Arizona we have a rather colorful and complicated history with the Yaqui tribe and the different communities that are located basically between Tucson and Phoenix, and then of course their heartland is in Sonora. Now the complicated part is in Sonora the Yaquis were supporting Maximilian for very complicated reasons.
Interesting. So then, was Spanish mainly the language used, or I guess since they had very few officers, it would have been English in terms of their training and commands, etc.?
Most of the officers were bilingual. Even the ones who were Anglo were bilingual. Cremini spoke Spanish fluently, and he was known to be really. Major Cremini was the second battalion commander for the native cavalry. He spoke both English and Spanish fluently. Most of the officers spoke English and Spanish. There is one officer, at least one officer, Lieutenant Soto. They say he barely speaks English. So there's some controversy over, well, should we have officers that can't speak English? But of course, even like there's one of the De La Guerras, there's a Lieutenant De La Guerra. He is said to really speak poor English, but they concede that because of the kind of the power the De La Guerra family has in Santa Barbara, there's no way they could have anybody who wasn't a member of the family in the chain of command. So that's one of the concessions they make. But most of the officers speak both English and Spanish. Could we talk a little bit about their first battalion commander?
Please.
Yeah,
please.
Their first battalion commander was Salvador Vallejo. And if you've heard of Salvador Vallejo's brother, but haven't heard of Salvador, there's good reason for that, apparently. Mariano Vallejo was, famous for being very smart and cultured and this great kind of diplomat as well as a political leader. By the time the Native Cavalry is organized, I think he's already in his 60s. So they don't turn to him to take any role in the battalion. Instead, they talk to his brother, Salvador Vallejo. Salvador's his younger brother, has extensive military experience as a militia officer, both in California and under the United States. Supposedly, one of the accounts of him is that in his numerous campaigns against various tribal folks in California, he had broken nearly every bone in his body. That was his. That was almost like a qualification. Well, he's been injured more times than anyone else. He turns out to be everything that his brother wasn't. He's like known to be rude. A lot of women just don't like him. They stay away from him. In fact, I think Mariano Vallejo and his wife actually had a dispute, and his wife did not want Salvador Vallejo living on the property. Mariano insisted, so she went away for a while, and he was apparently just a really foul guy and was not very good at doing his duties as major of the battalion. There's a lot of paperwork that just wasn't being done. He had apparently, I'm not going to say commissioned, but he had appointed some officers and nobody knew where they were. And they were never they're not on the rolls or anything. It's like, oh, no, I appointed this guy to do recruiting out there. And then people get confused about who's supposed to be doing the recruiting. So he was eventually forced out. And then he writes, or rather, I think he narrates a kind of a memoir, I think, to Bancroft. And when he they ask him about the native cavalry. He says, well, I felt uh, I had to do something to help the Union, the cause of the Union, because that's the only thing that stands between, it was something along the lines of, it's the only thing that stands between democracy and Republican government in the Western Hemisphere and the tyranny of the European powers. So obviously he's looking at the whole conflict in Mexico. And he even says, I don't care about the African Americans. They're irrelevant. It's about preserving democracy and Republican government. But then he says, but I'm not going to say anything else. He doesn't give any accounts of what he did as commander of Native Cavalry. He just says, I felt I had to do it, and that's it.
Yeah, that would make, well, if that was how his command went, the way you described it, makes sense, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
How did the unit dress? What were they? Did they have regular uniforms?
Unfortunately, they did. Apparently, yeah.
Unfortunately,
I was hoping. There's a book that a friend of mine wrote in Texas about the Mexican American union units in Texas. They also had. I mean, he thinks they may have been Lancers as well, although there's no definite proof of this. But he has on the cover a photo of one of the. I think he's a corporal in one of these Texas units, and he's wearing just a standard Union cavalry uniform, but he has a sombrero, and it's like, oh, that's great. I hope I have evidence that that's the way these guys are dressed, but I'm thinking the fact that I don't have evidence either way about their uniforms is an indication that they just wore the same uniforms that everyone else did. There's even like some when Captain Pico is in the Humboldt district, there's even just some throwaway comment about them throwing their caps in the air, and it's like, oh, they just had the same caps that the other soldiers had. Although I'm pretty sure that most of the California volunteers wore the Hardy hat without any decoration on it, just as a good practical wide brimmed hat. And I think that's probably how they dressed.
I see. So how was the unit eventually disbanded or closed down? It was a pretty brief time, it seems, that they were in existence.
Yeah, they. I'm sorry, I'm running low on power here. They just had the 3-year window that all the volunteer units had, and I think their enlistments all expired in March of 1866. So it was just kind of standard bureaucratic stuff. They march out of Arizona. One of the companies, and I'm not entirely sure why, actually gets on ocean going. Well, they get on at Yuma. They get on a steamer, and then they get on an ocean going steamer around the Gulf of California and get dropped off, I think, in Los Angeles, and then they march to back to Santa Barbara and have a parade. But the other units, they just come back. Apparently, their uniforms were in a really bad state because there are accounts of them getting their final settlement on their salaries and all just rushing to clothing stores. So it's probably the same story you see repeated with a lot of the California volunteer units, especially. They just come back. The only ones who get any special recognition are Company C in Santa Barbara, because, of course, of the influence of the De La Guerra family, and that these people were such a big part of that community. That unit is very much about Santa Barbara to an extent that the others are not. about their places they're from.
So was there, and just to wrap up, because I know you're running low on power.
Yeah.
Is there any place that we can go, either in California, Arizona, or elsewhere, any museum exhibits, any monuments to this unit, or are they somewhat forgotten?
I know there's a guy in San Jose who's been trying to get the graves memorialized. He's located a few of the graves. He located Pico's grave in San Jose. So those exist. I know at the De La Guerra House, they in Santa Barbara, they had an exhibit about them at one point, and they may do that again. Other than that, Drum Barracks in Los Angeles has a little bit. To me, the best place to go is in Tubac, where they in Arizona, where they actually have one of the native cavalry lances on display. And I took issue with the interpretation, and I think they've corrected it since then. So yeah, there's really not. Again, yeah, these guys are unfortunately largely forgotten. The California volunteers in general are kind of forgotten, but these guys in particular, I think because they kind of come in the middle of the war, they don't really have a lot of colorful stuff that they're doing. And then I think, California, and, of course, this is something you're fighting against. California has and Arizona as well, they has a very kind of dismissive view of its own history. And people are very much wanting to move on and make progress rather than look back. And there's some virtue in that, but also it means that some of these very colorful stories that are important to who we are get forgotten.
I agree. Well, hopefully this will help. Your book and this interview and so on will help memorialize these companies, this battalion, a little bit more. And I do think it's an important part of the history of the West. And I'm glad I learned about it. I'm glad I got to talk to you. Tom Przylski, do you have any other projects going on right now?
I'm researching a book about one of the territorial legislatures in Arizona. Probably not something that interests you necessarily, but the weird connection with the native cavalry is when I was doing the research, one of the big issues was everyone has trouble getting to the Capitol during the 1885 session. And there's actually a newspaper account saying, this is the worst winter since 1865-66. And I'm thinking, oh, wait a minute. That's when the native cavalry was in Arizona, and it gave them a lot of problems then. So it's like, okay, I know about this. So, yeah.
Well, good. Well, we'll look forward to it. I'm sure there'll be interesting information in there, especially if it ties into the native cavalry.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time. This was fascinating. And once again, a little plug for the book, Californio Lancers, the 1st Battalion of Native Cavalry in the Far West, 1863 to 1866, by Tom Przylski.
Yeah, University of Oklahoma Press.
That's right, University of Oklahoma Press. I mean, they do some great things about California history and Western history in general.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the California Frontier Show. If you'd like to support the show, the best thing to do is to let other people know about it. If you'd like to support it monetarily, there are a couple ways of doing that. One is by scrolling down in your podcast app to where it says support the show. There you can become a subscriber for as little as $3 a month. And if you want to give a one-time donation, just below you'll see where it says give a one-time donation. Finally, the show is supported by California History Teachers, which is a full year of lessons for 4th grade California history and social studies. You can find out more at www.californiahistoryteachers.com. And if you input the coupon code podcast, you'll receive 25% off your monthly or annual subscription. So check it out